So Peter Sutcliffe died yesterday at HMP Franklin, County Durham, not far from here. And he will forever be infamous as the Yorkshire Ripper. Um, now, I think it's very important when you get the demise of someone as infamous as Peter Sutcliffe, it needs to be handled in the right way. And I have to say, the media coverage of the news yesterday was good insofar as it was responsible. So instead of focusing just on the notoriety of Sutcliffe, they focus on the victims. And the Daily Mirror today had this headline: no copyright infringement intended. This is the Daily Mirror. So you can see the photo doesn't depict Sutcliffe, but it depicts his 13 victims, 13 fatal victims. He had other victims who survived. Um, Between 1975 and 1980, Sutcliffe murdered the following women: Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jim McDonald, Jane Jordan, Yvonne Pearson, Helen Ritka, Vera Millward, Josephine Whitaker, Barbara Leach, Marguerite Walls, and Jacqueline Hill. And like I said, there was other women attacked. So their names should be remembered, and I think it was good that the media handled that in that way yesterday to focus on the victims. I think that's the way it should be. However, when you get a case as notorious as the Yorkshire Ripper case, I think it's valid to consider, in from a policing perspective, what went wrong, what went right. Not much in that case, and I don't want to say lessons that could be learned because it almost sounds like a cliche. I think it's very, very difficult to totally stop serial killers. I mean, since that case, we've had the so-called Suffolk Strangler um, in uh, in 2006 when five women were killed. But there are a lot of things from the case that do stand out. Before I continue talking a bit about this, there was actually another case at the same time, um, but further to the east, in the East Riding area, particularly around Hull, involving a character by the name of Bruce George Peter Lee. Um, yeah, Bruce George Peter Lee. Now, he actually killed 15 people, and he ranks as one of Britain's worst serial killers, but I reckon most people haven't heard his name. And it's interesting that different kinds of crimes get different attention. Now, in the case of Bruce George Peter Lee, his crimes tended to be arson, and in at least one of those cases, his victims, it sounds harsh to say, but they were known as a troubled family, so maybe there was a lack of sympathy from the wider public. That's awful. That was the context of that case. Um, he died as well. No, he didn't actually. He's still alive. And my mistake. I'm getting him mixed up with another person I'm going to mention in this video. But his crimes were from 1973 to 1979. 15 victims. The Yorkshire Ripper killed 13, so he was actually more prolific, but far less known. I think the reason that Sutcliffe's crimes garnered such attention was the brutality of them. You know, he beat these women with, as I understand, a blunt object. I don't know if it was a claw hammer or don't quote me on that. I can't recall, but they were particularly savage crimes, and it obviously brought back echoes of the infamous Jack the Ripper case and also the Hammersmith Ripper or the Jack the Stripper murders of 1960s London. I think it's fair to say that the Yorkshire Ripper case is probably the most infamous of the second half of the 20th century in this country. There are others that are infamous, of course, Fred and Rosemary West and Moors murders, but I think there's something particular about the name of Peter Sutcliffe in that case, and I think it's partly to do with the impact it had on society, much more so than the uh, Bruce George Peter Lee case. So which was around the Hull area. With Peter Sutcliffe's crimes, they were around Leeds, Bradford, Halifax, and I think at least one of the murders was in Manchester. Um, it's notorious for a lot of reasons, partly the handling of the case. George Oldfield, the police superintendent in charge, was heavily criticised for his handling, and he died of a heart attack in 1985. So it may be the pressures of that case. Um, I'm not sure about that because it was 4 years after that, but he did get a heavy criticism, some of it deserved, because West Yorkshire police were displaying a degree of misogyny insofar as their treatment of the victims. And so was the press at the time. There was this attitude that because a lot of the women were prostitutes, they were somehow deserving of it or less sympathetic. This can also be seen in crimes where the victims are gay men. At a time, it wouldn't be so much today, but the crimes of Dennis Nelson, for example, a lot of people, frankly, it's very sad to say, but they had a sort of distant or cold attitude to the fact that these were gay young men, homeless. There's a different emotive response that people have from bigotry to, say, if the victim was a middle class little girl. It's harsh to say, but there is unfortunately a victim hierarchy. And if anything changes from this case, I hope it's that. I hope that there's compassion for all victims of violent crime. So the way the press and the police were handling this was, oh well, they're just prostitutes. Um, but it had a real social impact because they developed a vigilante attitude around the Leeds area, and there also developed a great mistrust between men and women. So fathers, boyfriends, brothers started to get suspicion on them. Women started a campaign called Reclaim the Night, where they understandably said, why should we be the ones that have to change our behaviour? Um, Prostitution is a complex subject. Why do people get into it? Poverty, addiction, there's a lot of reasons. But they made this campaign that we should, it shouldn't be determined by the killer. Unfortunately, it did mean that probably innocent men were had suspicion fallen on them by frightened women and others. So it really had a toxic influence on society. And in Sunderland, we've got a connection to the case because of and this has actually generated documentaries of its own. So notorious was it. Wearside Jack, John Humble, he was a Sunderland man who made an infamous hoax tape, and he basically said, "I see you have no luck catching me, George, but Lord, the only time your boys came near catching me," and it was basically taunting the police. Now, Oldfield really hooked in on this and was convinced the killer was from the northeast of England based on this accent. And so a lot of the investigation focused up here. Meanwhile, women who had survived the attacks were adamant that he was a local man, which of course he turned out to be. Sutcliffe was a lorry driver and he was from, I don't know where he was born, but he was certainly from the Leeds area. So that was one of the most negligent things about the case, disregarding survivor testimony. And I think maybe if a lesson has to be learned, it would be that no testimony should be discounted um, just because of a stubborn, dogged fixation that a detective has on a particular lead. Police work is very difficult, and I don't want to say I feel sorry for George Oldfield because I do think he was incompetent and I do think his force had a bad attitude. However, it's easy for people to throw stones, when you're getting a tape like that. Of course, they have to take it seriously. So I'm a little bit wary about being too critical of George Oldfield. I wasn't in his shoes. Nevertheless, I totally understand the anger of the survivors and their families and the victims and their families. Um, but anyway, I'll leave it there. In the UK, we don't quite sensationalize crime to the same extent as the United States, but we're not above it. I mean, ITV has kind of become famous for these docudramas of well-known cases, and it's covered pretty much all of them. Most recently, of course, David Tennant's very powerful portrayal of Dennis Nelson. Um, However, I've watched most of those, and I have to say they're handled well. They're not sensational, they're not gory, they're not just focusing on violence. I think that they do serve a purpose, but it is extremely important. And actually, I have to say, a lot of them were victim based. They were focusing on the victims. So I don't agree with those who say that it's just, you know, exploiting the crimes. I don't think that's entirely fair. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, by the way. You get some really tacky magazines, the true crime, and they're very, very sensationalist and tacky. And the tabloid press has a long history of doing that. I think they probably have improved a little bit in recent years, but it's always been there to some extent, and that's not a new thing. It goes right back to the Jack the Ripper case. You could see how the London Illustrated News handled that case. It was totally sensationalist. So when you have a high-profile case, the police are under enormous pressure. That's where mistakes can be made, and that is also where innocent people can be implicated because the police are under pressure to get someone. So when the public demand justice, it's understandable, but they also have to be aware that the police need to explore every avenue. And I think one lesson from this case is that in that situation, they didn't. They disregarded survivor testimony. But I would say this now that Sutcliffe is, you know, consigned to history. I just hope that the survivors can have some closure. I don't think you could ever fully move on from something like that. But he's now history, and so his case won't be history. They'll probably always be interested in it, but um, I think it's right that the focus is on the victims, and I hope some lessons have been learned from it. Um, right, I'll leave it there, and thanks for watching.